Welcome to my channel. You may know them as one of the most common ingredients in pizza sauce, but did you know that tomatoes weren't always loved? In fact, for much of human history, they were considered poisonous. Let us take a bite out of this juicy topic as we explore where tomatoes actually came from and how they became such a beloved part of our diet. If you think back to the last time you enjoyed a burger or an Italian sandwich, chances are you probably bit into something that had tomato in it. Tomatoes are now used in cuisines all over the world, from spicy shakshuka in Israel to rich stews in India and, of course, ketchup in America. But these little spheres of flavor didn't start out in Italy or even Europe. They traveled across the globe from the Americas. Botanists believe tomatoes originated in what is now South America and Mexico. Their wild ancestors likely grew in what is today's southern Peru and northern Chile, with some species still growing there to this day. These early forms of tomatoes were small and spiky and looked more like tiny blackberries than your typical supermarket fare. People have been cultivating them for over 7,500 years. Some scientists even say that pre-Columbian people in Mexico domesticated them specifically for their ornamental value as much as their flavor. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they found Native Americans using the fruit to make a kind of red dye. The Aztecs called the tomato quitamate, which could be translated to little plums. It was Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, that gave us the word tomato. When Europeans encountered tomatoes, they brought the word back with them. At first, they didn't seem too excited about the food itself. In 1596, an account written by Spanish historian Francisco Hernández described the Quito market. He noted its medicinal properties, claiming that it helped cure sore throats and gout. But he also described it as a little apple that was not good to eat, although apparently it could be eaten if boiled in vinegar. So great, you can use it as medicine or you can boil it in vinegar. How exactly does that translate to the tasty treat we know today? Well, tomatoes sat in Europe for a few decades after the 16th century, mostly ignored. That was partly because of a persistent myth that tomatoes were poisonous. This stemmed from the fact that they belonged to the nightshade family of plants, which includes deadly nightshade belladonna, whose name translates to beautiful lady, and whose berries have long been known to be toxic. Tomatoes were grouped with other members of the nightshade family, even though there wasn't any real evidence that they were dangerous. Still, caution prevailed. For centuries, people believed that eating them could cause hallucinations and other unwanted effects. And the idea stuck around until at least the 18th century. Another reason tomatoes didn't catch on was because of their appearance. They were often confused with the deadly Cape gooseberry, which grows in similar climates and has a similarly colored skin. Tomatoes were even banned in some places because of the potential confusion, including the U.S. colonies in the late 1700s. It turns out that even our founding fathers couldn't see past their bad reputation. But in the meantime, tomatoes made their way to the Old World, Asia, Africa, and Europe through the Ottoman Empire, and eventually found their way to Italy, where they finally started gaining popularity. By the mid-1700s, Neapolitan cookbooks began featuring recipes with tomatoes, and it didn't take long for the rest of Europe to follow suit. In the early 1800s, a dish called puttanesca was created in Naples. It featured tomatoes, olives, and garlic, and it was served in brothy restaurants. Legend has it that the dish was made by prostitutes who were trying to impress sailors, and they added lots of pepper to the mix to heat things up. Put means prostitute in Neapolitan, and the name has since become synonymous with a spicy pasta sauce. By the 1830s, tomatoes were a common sight on tables throughout Italy. There was one particularly dramatic moment when French chef Jean-Antoine Bria-Savarin claimed in his 1825 book, The Physiology of Taste, that tomatoes would soon replace the apple as the king of fruits. Love them or hate them, it seems like everyone wanted to get their hands on a tomato, and as the demand increased, so did production. By 1834, over 20,000 tons of tomatoes were being exported from the US to Europe each year, and this trade continued to grow. Italian immigrants carried their love of tomatoes to other parts of the world, including South Africa and Australia. In the mid-1800s, the tomato was truly going global. But despite their widespread adoption, tomatoes almost met a tragic end in the 19th century. In 1820, an Irish botanist named Robert Bentley first identified a fungus that was causing tomato plants to wither away, and within 20 years, the disease known as late blight had spread to tomatoes all over the world. It devastated harvests and nearly wiped out the tomato altogether. Scientists think the fungus reached North America via infected European tomatoes and caused such damage that many farmers abandoned crops entirely. Some varieties were more resistant to the fungus than others, but the overall crop yield suffered, and while the fungus didn't end up killing off the tomato, it was definitely a close call. As the 19th century drew to a close, however, people had fallen head over heels for the versatile ingredient. Tomatoes were no longer seen as strange or scary. They were everywhere, including in art. An 1888 painting by Georges Seurat, A Corner of a Kitchen Garden at Montgeron, shows a still life of tomatoes, basil, beans, corn, and other foods that are now staples of summer salads. And while the painter's work is simple, it reflects a change in perception. Tomatoes were no longer something exotic or taboo. They were commonplace and comfortable. They were even taking center stage. A few years later, in 1893, artist Paul Cézanne painted a still life that depicted two large, ripe tomatoes surrounded by other produce. Seen in isolation, the subject matter isn't all that radical. But considering that tomatoes were still relatively new in European cuisine, this was a big deal. They were clearly becoming a favorite among artists who were looking for inspiration. However, tomatoes hadn't quite caught on in the US yet. In fact, the whole country was still catching on to the idea of eating them. Up until the mid-1800s, most Americans thought they were poisonous, and then people started to warm up to the idea of eating them raw, but the preference was still to cook them. The earliest recipe to include tomatoes that appeared in an American cookbook was in 1832. It called for stewing tomatoes with butter, salt, and pepper. Since the theory that tomatoes were poisonous lingered for so long in American consciousness, early recipes tended to include lots of strong flavors to counteract the supposed danger. In other words, a little goes a long way. But the tomato would soon find its calling in America. By the 1840s, tomatoes were commonly eaten in the US, and they were especially popular with the working class. And by the 1860s, they were seen as an affordable luxury good. Farmers even started to organize tomato festivals to celebrate their favorite fruit. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, Americans turned to canned tomatoes as a cheap source of nutrition. Canned tomatoes were also sent to soldiers during World War II, and they remained an important part of American cuisine through the latter half of the 20th century. Eventually, they became a staple of diets all over the world. Today, tomatoes come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. But what exactly makes them so lovable? Maybe it's their versatility. They can be fresh or canned, cooked or raw. They can be sweet or savory, smooth or chunky. Or maybe it's their convenience. Tomatoes are available year-round and they store well, so you can buy them in bulk and use them when you want. They're even sold in pretty much every color imaginable, except, yes, green, or maybe it's their flavor. Tomatoes contain compounds that are released when they're exposed to air. This gives them a unique taste depending on how they re-prepared and why people love them so much. And according to recent research, that flavor might be tied to some health benefits. Lycopene, the compound that gives tomatoes their signature red color, has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. Studies suggest that it might reduce the risk of certain chronic diseases. So not only do tomatoes taste delicious, they might be good for you. We don't know exactly how people fell in love with tomatoes. After all, it took them a while to catch on. But it's clear that they've earned their place at the table. Once they overcame their reputation for being dangerous, they became one of the most beloved fruits in the world. Now, next time you dig into a plate of spaghetti and meatballs or dig into a juicy burger with ketchup, you'll know just how far the tomato has come. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments below what other everyday objects you'd like to learn more about.